You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast that showcases the research currently being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany. My name is Christopher Murphy, and I'll be sitting down with researchers to talk about their projects, the various methods they use, and how their findings have impacted legal, criminological and psychological research in Germany and abroad. All this and more on Doing Time, Talking Crime. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to the next episode of Doing Time, Talking Crime. As always, it's great to have you here with us today. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the overlap that often exists between victims and offenders and the effect that short-term mindsets can have on the likelihood of falling victim to or committing a crime. To do so, I'm joined in the studio by Sebastian Kübel. Sebastian grew up in the city of Karlsruhe, Germany, and I'm beginning to think there must be something in the water up there, as you're the second criminologist I've had on the show from Karlsruhe in as many weeks. And Sebastian, you told me before the show that you studied psychology here in Freiburg and spent time at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, and that you've been working as a doctoral student since 2020 at the Max Planck Institute's Department of Criminology in the CRIMETIME Project. Sebastian, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to present my research here.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I guess before we get to the results of some of the research you've done so far and what you found in the CRIMETIME Project, there's probably two terms that you need to define for us, and that would be the victim-offender overlap and short-term mindsets. Let's perhaps start with the victim-offender overlap.
Okay, thank you, Chris. The victim-offender overlap is a really established finding in the meantime in criminology, which is consistently found in a huge variety of data sets, but that is not really obvious because in the past, going back in time, research in criminology was very much separated into research on offenders and research on victims, and the mere connection between the two was seen in the fact that most crimes need some form of an offender and some form of a victim. And it was not until around the 1950s when the first observations were made that in studying victims, most of these victims had already offended themselves. So that was quite interesting finding and provoked lots of studies. And more investigations subsequently revealed that victims and offenders actually have more in common than was previously believed. Okay,
and is there, from this research about this overlap between victims and offenders, are there any predominant theories thus far? What could explain that?
Yeah, so basically the phenomenon was that victims and offenders share certain personality traits and attitudes, and they have similar routines. But even more than that, victims and offenders turned out to be often one and the same persons. The basic phenomenon says that offenders are more likely than non-offenders to be victims, and victims are also more likely to become offenders than do non-victims. And coming to your question about theories, there is a theory that tried to explain the overlap just with revenge in subgroups where conflicts are normally resolved with retaliatory violence.
Revenge then from a victim, getting vengeance for what's happened to them.
Exactly. But yeah, as I said, this explanation only holds for certain subgroups where these norms are established, like resolving conflicts with violence, and cannot really account for the pervasiveness of the phenomenon.
No, because it's a society-wide phenomenon.
Yeah, you find it really in a huge variety of data sets, cultures, and samples. And other predominant theories then explain the overlap with shared underlying factors. So they hypothesized common causes that lead both to offending and victimization. So common causes might be personality traits like low self-control, or also like the same shared routines, risky activities.
Also maybe a shared way of life, or also
shared settings, shared
environments. Yeah,
exactly.
So there seems to be a few quasi-theories about what could lead to this causal nexus between victimization and later offending. But you weren't quite happy with this, and you've kind of, you and your fellow researchers have given the matter some thought, and you told me before the show you've come up with a new possible explanation, and that has to do with the concept of short-term mindsets. Maybe tell us a little bit about what that term encompasses.
Yeah, so short-term mindsets actually describe a focus on the present at the expense of considering the future.
Okay.
That is like the main short-term mindsets. And this tendency is captured by a variety of concepts, for example, by impulsivity. And as you may know, impulsive persons tend to act out their immediate urges.
Sure.
And normally they rather do not that much reflect on long-term consequences of their behavior.
Okay.
And another related concept, which also fits into this broader term of short-term mindsets, is risk-seeking, where people tend to seek risk and thrills without thinking about negative consequences that might also be more long-term.
Because I guess one could ask, I mean, is a short-term mindset, is it something positive? Is it negative? We've got the old Latin dictum of carpe diem. That would seem to suggest that it's positive to act now and rather than wait till tomorrow.
That's right. Well, generally, I think that a certain amount of present orientation is healthy and good. I think it's detrimental just to focus on the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's not well for well-being to just follow goals in a far future and not being able to enjoy the present moment, to be completely present in the here and now.
Okay.
But on the other hand, a pure present focus is also not good, because if you do not take into consideration your future, that has already been shown to prevent professional success. And
so that's a short-term mindset in that sense is really, really living the now, throwing caution to the wind about any future consequences.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there is a huge variety of unwanted outcomes.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And why would an individual then be inclined to adopt a short-term mindset?
Under some conditions, it might make sense to prioritize the present. And it's perhaps also important to say that in criminology, a common perspective is to see present orientation only as maladaptive and also only resulting from an inability to consider the future. Okay. But as we saw it, it might be also a deliberative decision or motivation not to consider the future, but instead focus on the present. I know that maybe it's not appropriate from a more general view, given what we scientifically know about the actual outcomes, but at least from a subjective point of view, it might actually make sense or feel to make sense to prioritize the present.
Okay.
That is, going back to this Latin dictum, there's a similar saying which says you should live every day as if it were your last.
Right.
So there is always the possibility that you could die tomorrow, or you could have an injury or something that prevents you from doing the things you want.
Certainly, okay.
So in these cases, it doesn't really make sense to sacrifice the present just for delayed rewards in a future that might perhaps not even exist, right?
I see, okay. And then though, they're obviously, when we're talking about the victims of crime, that's where your kind of thesis comes in there with that they then are more likely to live the present because they have a more negative view then of the future.
That's basically what my thinking was about when approaching this question. Searching through prior research, I encountered some evidence that a similar process is actually triggered when experiencing victimization. So by this important life event, people become suddenly aware of their vulnerability. And some studies show that victims consequently believe their future is less certain, less under their control, and maybe feel higher chances that the plans and goals and desires they had might perhaps not work out as they intended.
Okay, and how does that then, so if we have victims on the one hand who have let's say more negative expectations then about their future, what was your hypothesis then about how that feeds into the victim-offender overlap? Yeah,
so with this perspective of an uncertain and bleak future, we thought, this is one of the cases where it somehow, at least subjectively, makes sense not to defer rewards, but instead focus on immediate benefits.
Okay.
But then it is quite known in criminology that the benefits of crime are more immediate, and potential consequences, if you're getting caught by the police, for example, are more delayed. So we thought that maybe the victimization experience triggers some form of short-term mindsets, which then does also make crime more appealing. We thought that this increased focus on the present might actually lead victims to commit crime.
Okay. You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. All right. Well, I guess now you've given us the background there and given us an understanding of the concepts that are involved. Maybe let's now take a look at some of the findings that you've had from the CRIMETIME project. Maybe take a moment to explain the data collection and also the methods of analysis that you used.
Okay. So for this project, we were not really involved in data collection because we used third-party data.
Okay. Do you have to purchase said third-party data, or you have friends in high places, or how does that work?
It's more the friends in high places, if you will. So it's good scientific collaborations.
Good okay,
there is data from a large longitudinal study which was conducted in the city of Zurich, where adolescents were followed over several years, and it really contains a huge variety, excellent and rich variables that make it possible to investigate delinquent behavior and also pro-social behavior. So imagine a few examples of these variables is, for example, of course, delinquent behavior and victimization, and also data on short-term mindsets. But more broadly spoken, it's about variables about personality, about attitudes, about self-reported behavior, about friend networks. So
education, neighborhoods, environment, everything.
Demographics.
Right, so it's a very rich, I like that word that you use there, data set that you have at your disposal.
Exactly. And so for the current project, we analyzed parts of this data, of course, not the whole bunch of variables.
Section.
Yeah, and what we did was we ran structural equation models, and in specific, because we had this hypothesis that short-term mindsets might mediate the effect from victimization to offending, we ran mediation analysis.
Okay.
And perhaps importantly, at least from a scientific context, we also controlled for a variety of other confounding variables.
Okay.
So, for example, it is important to control for prior propensities to be involved in crime, and also prior levels of short-term mindsets, because then otherwise it could be just the explanation that short-term mindsets might have provoked, as the common causes theories stated it, might have caused victimization and might have caused in the longer term offending.
Okay.
So that's why we control.
When you say you control this, how does one, is this kind of individually you have to control all these variables, or you use a program to control the variables?
That is luckily enough done by a program.
Okay. That's probably very good. So how many individuals were included in the data collection?
That's also something. The data set is not only rich in variables, but it also contains lots of adolescents. So it was in total 1,675 adolescents. What they did is they first interviewed a huge majority of the primary school starters in Zurich, and they then subsequently followed them over childhood and adolescence.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, so it's been a real longitudinal study then.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. I guess now, how have the findings that you've been doing your data analysis overlapped with your hypotheses?
Yeah, actually, we were really happy about the findings, because as predicted, victimization seemed really to trigger short-term mindsets. So we saw an increase in impulsivity. There was more risk-seeking after the victimization events, and also the victims of crime were less future-oriented. And then importantly, for this mediation hypothesis, we also found that these increases in short-term mindsets then predict later offending. So short-term mindsets did really explain a good part of this effect of victimization on offending.
Okay, is it possible to say how much longer, or what's the variable, the time variable there between, for instance, being the victim of a crime and then becoming an offender? Was you able to work that out?
No, not really. I mean, that is also an interesting question of how time plays a role here. Whether it's perhaps years, or does the effect perhaps decrease with the longer time periods?
Okay, sure.
In our case, we had offending measured 2 years after victimization.
Okay. So I guess you have to set for your own study, some variables that you have to say, we have the parameters, I guess.
That's right. Yeah. So it would be cool to run a study where we have different time scales and see whether this association between victimization and offending perhaps decreases or persists in over various time scales.
Okay. So that's research for another day, so to say.
That's right.
Okay, it's all right. So the findings overlapped well with the hypotheses, and you're happy about that.
That's right.
I guess I have a question maybe to Zurich itself. I mean, Zurich, Switzerland, it's obviously a very affluent city, and while it no doubt has its problems, it kind of makes me wonder, I guess, whether your findings might have been different if the data sample was drawn from elsewhere.
That's actually a good remark. Of course, Zurich is known to be a rather rich city and with high incomes. But even in such a city, there are people who are better situated and people who are worse off. Also, I recently read that Zurich is still one of the top 3 or top 5 of the most expensive cities in the world. So even if you have high income,
it doesn't
really make life very easy there. So what was really important for our study was that there was a variety in terms of victimization. So people who had more or less victimization experiences, or who had never been victimized at all. But of course, I also think it would be interesting to run a similar study in different cultures, different samples.
Sure, that's right. Such data is then theoretically comes available from time to time, or I mean, that's not the only longitudinal study of its kind, right?
Of course, there are some criminological data sets which are exploited over and over again for several studies. But of course, we have to make sure that the variables we need are measured appropriately and are included in the data set.
Okay. All right. Okay. No, that kind of got me thinking, what would it be like in Berlin or in New York or something like that? But I mean, as we say, research for another day, or from some colleagues in Berlin or the US.
Hopefully.
If we then take a step back, actually, we've worked out, you've told us now about your findings and this causal nexus between short-term mindsets and later offending. How could victims of crime then be supported so as to not develop such short-term mindsets? And I guess my second question to that is, who's best positioned to provide that support? But please answer the first one first.
So for the first question, we have also discussed whether it's good to have these short-term mindsets or whether it's detrimental to have these short-term mindsets. So perhaps first it is important to recapitulate why it is actually important to prevent victims from developing increased short-term mindsets. Because this is not only having an effect on offending, but it also, we know from other criminological studies, that more short-term mindsets also predict a higher likelihood of re-victimization and of maladaptive coping behaviors like substance use. So
I see, right.
This would really...
So a short-term mindset is damaging or negative if it takes the upper hand.
That's right, at least from what we know. So we talked about the subjective perspective. It seems to make sense perhaps under some conditions.
Sure.
But from a more scientific or objective viewpoint, we know from many studies that at least in the longer term, there are lots of detrimental outcomes of having too high or increased short-term mindsets. Interventions for victims of crime should perhaps try to build back a positive future for victims, and also try to encourage victims to consider future outcomes.
Okay.
And then I think, you raised a good second question.
Sure.
Who is the appropriate person to provide that support? I think, of course, it is the most important point, the most important step at first is that victims go this step and actually search for help and report that they have been victimized, because otherwise they cannot be helped at all. But if that is the case, then I think psychotherapists or other helping people could provide the necessary support. So, for example, here in Germany and also in some other European countries at least, we have an association called the Weiße Ring, which provides support for victims of crime. And these people have social workers who could either directly help by such interventions or help them find the way to other professionals.
Okay. Yeah. And Sebastian, do you intend to share the results of your research with victim support groups?
Of course, this would be very good. I would really like to do that. At first, of course, this has to be published in the scientific fields, with all this process of peer review systems.
Sure.
But then afterwards, of course, it is a big dream of scientists not to have only the study for its own sake, but to really have an impact on society and make the world just a little better.
Oh, that's lovely. It's a good note to end our interview on, a very positive note, and we'll hope that you are able to do that. So I guess that's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for coming and joining us. You've certainly provided with plenty of food for thought for the old adage that time heals all wounds. Best of luck with the rest of the project and the publication, and enjoy the rest of your time doing your doctoral thesis at the Institute.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's program. If you would like to hear additional podcasts or learn more about our research, please visit our website at www.csl.mpg.de.